In this video, I'll be discussing two approaches to composition, sharpening and leveling. Composition is a pretty broad subject, and there have been many books written describing various compositional approaches, structures, and strategies. This is one area where there truly is no universal language for design. However, there are widely shared terms and ways of talking about composition. In the book A Primer of Visual Literacy, Dundas A. Dundas uses terms derived from psychology to describe two different approaches to composition, sharpening and leveling. Essentially, how Dundas describes it is that sharpening a composition involves increasing levels of visual contrast within the composition. Leveling involves decreasing levels of visual contrast to create a more harmonious but still visually interesting composition. Let's break down some of the distinctions between sharpening and leveling by going through some key terms associated with them. A sharpening approach to composition will make use of asymmetry, a strong axis or sense of direction, making objects feel off balance. A leveling approach to composition will move towards greater stability and balance. Think symmetry or sense of alignment. Sharpness favors contrast, while leveling is about harmony. Sharpness is aligned with surprise or the unfamiliar, whereas leveling makes use of the familiar. In sharp compositions, you'll see more variability in the position of elements, creating a sense of floatiness or movement. Elements in a level composition are more stable, clustered, or anchored. And finally, a sharp approach creates a dramatic sense of depth. A level approach seeks a sense of evenness. So to summarize, increasing visual compositional contrast creates a sharpening effect. Decreasing visual contrast creates a leveling effect. So let's look at two posters from the CalArts poster archive that use sharpening as an approach to composition. In this first example, designed by Onyu Kim and Vivian Naranjo, there's definitely a sense of being off balance in the composition. The elements feel as though we've caught them in a moment of free fall, kind of moving through space and spilling off the page. We also see numerous elements of visual contrast in the poster. Contrast of scale, here in some of the foreground elements contrasting to smaller elements in the background. Contrast of color, we've got a full range of colors, reds, pinks, purples. Contrast of value, ranging from black to very, very pale. And finally, contrast of texture. We've got photographic elements, solid vector shapes, and smooth gradients, creating a pretty interesting palette of textures. In this poster, we definitely see a sense of surprise or unpredictability with regard to the imagery. Instead of seeing a familiar image of a dancer or a still image from a performance, we're seeing body parts and graphic shapes that are dancing together with letter forms in space. Clearly, the designers have chosen a less conventional and more surprising way of representing the performance. The graphic elements are also floating and dispersed around the composition, creating a sense of variability. There's also a strong diagonal axis that we see here in this isometric frame that's repeated here in F200 and echoed in some of the alignments of the graphic elements. Here between these two photographic shapes, for example, and here between these two blue tubes. So we've got both floatiness and movement and a strong sense of direction. And in addition to that, we've also got a pretty dramatic sense of foreground, middle ground, background. We have elements coming into the frame from the extreme foreground, and then the middle ground is occupied by this frame structure, and the background looks like an overlapping series of translucent planes. In the second example, we can use the same checklist of terms to analyze this poster for Beek Vanderpoel, designed by Enrique Eira and Yoonji Jun. Again, there's a feeling of being off balance in the composition. And although the rectangle right here in the center seems like a very stable architectural presence, we also have these banner shapes that come into and fly out of the compositional space, combined with this type and these other banner-like shapes, they start to create kind of a rotating motion that definitely undermines the stability of this frame. There's also lots of visual contrast in this poster, but probably the most notable is that extreme contrast of scale that we see here with the typography. The Bic Van der Pol is coming in from the extreme foreground, really large scale type, contrasted to the much smaller type that kind of sits in this middle ground space, and the body text here that describes the artist's work. Pretty large range of contrast of scale. The element of surprise here is not so much the type in the banner. That's a pretty familiar graphic trope or motif, but it's the behavior of the banner that kind of feels fresh and unexpected. It really is pulling us down from off the poster into the space of the poster to this vanishing point and then back out again. It's not the most conventional or expected way for a banner to behave. And in terms of variability, we do have, as I mentioned before, anchored elements and moving elements. And what that sets up for us is this interesting tension between very traditional architectural gridded structures or ways of using space and these more dynamic, expressive ways of using space. So here the variability is kind of about the coexistence of two very different structures or approaches to organizing space. And finally, depth, which we've touched on a little bit before already. The extreme vanishing point here and elements moving from off the page back into deep space and out again. And it does look like we've got an extreme foreground, the frame being the middle ground, and then these hand-drawn elements that seem to push behind the frame create a background. Now, let's look at two examples of leveling from the CalArts poster archive. This is a poster by Karen Aono for the CalArts Spring Music Festival in 1996. The top part of the poster features a graphic translation of what looks like a flower whose petals are made of words describing the musical genres represented in the festival. The abstract flower shape also feels kind of musical in the way it seems to undulate and move and swirl in the air, kind of like a cloud of sound. And this large floral cloud sound mass is balanced by this carpet of blooms, a pattern made of little flowers that are bloomin', and the negative space below it that contains information about the music festival. So while this composition is not symmetrical, it feels evenly weighted in top and bottom. The overall visual palette is also really harmonious. And what I mean by that is there's a pretty limited range of colors. So we see 1, 2, 3, 4 plus white, if we want to count that. It's a 5-color palette. And the only medium for image making is vector drawing. So all of the imagery in the poster and the typography are made from solid vector shapes and lines, which restricts or limits the amount of contrast. So there's nothing extreme or jarring, and everything is harmonious. And of course, when we think spring, one of the first things we think of is flowers. Now, I want to point out that I'm not suggesting in any way that familiarity is a negative thing. In fact, quite the opposite in this case. What the designer's done by using a well-known symbol or visual metaphor is buying herself space for that symbol or visual metaphor to do or be more than one thing. And that's why we can understand it as being like a flower, but also like sound or like music or like dancing or like an instrument all at the same time without really being confused. It's abstract enough and familiar enough that it can be more than one thing at the same time. And of course, the composition does feel quite stable when we look at how architectural all of the axes are. So there's very strong vertical axes, very strong horizontal axes. Nothing feels as if it's moving dramatically. This cloud is kind of suspended in this space. It's not moving off the page or onto the page or crashing into any other elements. Everything seems to be kind of comfortably placed in relationship to each other. And finally, there is an overall feeling of evenness, which again is not to suggest that the poster is boring or dull. What happens when we have limited contrast and we're not focusing on movement and dynamic shifts of scale and value is we have time to look at the details and see how the letter forms grow and shrink, kind of like volume of music crescendoing and diminishing in volume throughout the arc of a piece of music. These details start to emerge because we have time and space to look at them in this very comfortable, pleasing composition. So again, we can use kind of the same checklist to look at our second example of a level composition. So when we look at this poster for visiting artist Mark Bradford, designed by Jeremy Landman and Xing Wang, in contrast to the last poster, the spring concert poster, this level composition feels balanced because it's almost an all-over pattern. The visual impression we have is of evenly spaced, similarly sized graphic elements. So naturally, this is a pretty harmonious effect. The balance of scale, the balance of spacing. And while we do have contrast of colors, so we do have a full range of values, black to white to a middle value red, and these colors are pretty contrasty. We can clearly see the edges on all of the colors in all of the elements, but the contrast of color and value is sort of mitigated or mellowed by the fact that everything's kind of the same scale and kind of evenly spaced. So we do have contrast in some areas, but it's balanced, or the rough or sharp edges are taken off that contrast. Now, while we may not think about a pattern of shoelaces and eyelets as being very familiar, they do behave exactly the way we would expect a pattern to behave. And the type, the stencil type in the background, behaves pretty much as we would expect stencil type to behave. It's set from top to bottom, left to right, in a very default or straightforward way that we would expect from stencil letter forms. And of course, the composition is quite stable. There aren't any big contrasts of scale that create extreme depth. There are no strong axes that suggest movements. Everything seems very solid. And of course, when you have patterns and a solid composition, you do have an overall sense of evenness. And again, I want to reiterate that I'm not suggesting in any way that this poster is boring or flat because of a level compositional strategy. What this evenness and overall harmony does, again, is give us time to look and notice details like how the shoelaces are threaded through the eyelets, and the shoelaces appear when there's descriptive text, but once we get to the artist's name, the shoelaces disappear and they kind of reappear below the artist's name. And most of the text is set as if somebody was painting letters with stencils until we get to the artist's name, which is made of the physical stencils themselves that are kind of shingled on top of each other, creating these unusual cropped letter forms. These kinds of small and thoughtful details emerge because we have a harmonious, balanced compositional space in front of us.